This is Soferville's Dark Season presents The Dead Famous, Episode 1, with Ronald Moger as James Montague, Jonah Richert as the voice of the press, Hazel Young as Helen Beeston and Sister Anna Patrick, and Colin Rance as Geoffrey Montague.
It's Friday, it's 5 to 5, and it's Crackerjack.
I suppose I knew from the very first camera I held that my calling in life had been found. Although my path to photographic success was sometimes blocked by idiots intent on my downfall, I managed to strive through with my sanity thankfully intact and my goals largely achieved, which is more than I can say for the idiots. Destiny deemed my future to be in journalism, specialising in the reported stories of actors and film folk in general. Their world appeared to be solely of glamour and riches. Unlike those great people, however, I was not born into a rich family myself. Our name of Montague was a moniker that had become associated with adventure and great landowners over the years due to the efforts of the more dramatic offshoots of the family. They had fought battles alongside kings, ventured overseas to cross great lands in the name of trade and empire. Geoffrey Montague, my father, had descended 12 generations ago from Robert Montague. While the rest of his brothers were sturdy warrior types, unfortunately for my strain of the family, Robert had been a weak and ineffectual addition to the family and had not entered the clergy as so many of the younger siblings did in those times. Not being deemed fit to join the exploits abroad with his brothers, he decided to put all of his inherited money into a type of seed drill, which unfortunately did nothing to move the agricultural development of England forwards, and just failed tremendously along with his heart just 6 months later, leaving behind an only son to continue his line. Yes, the name brought with it none of the expected associations previous members had brought it, and centuries passed so that we were as detached from the line as you can imagine, and it therefore meant little to me other than when signing cheques or knowing if letters had been delivered to the correct address when working. I apologise if the impression is given from the result of this unfortunate history that you might think that we are perhaps totally poor, which is not particularly the truth. My family lived comfortably enough and wanted for very little. Our home was a large terraced house in a leafy suburb of North London. Our neighbour's house to one side had been burned out in a mystery fire, and the owners had been never successfully traced, and so it stood and remained a sorry-looking scorched husk, unsold and unloved. The house to the other side was owned by a local businessman who'd made good with his life and moved to sunnier climes, apparently in such haste that he'd quite forgotten to sell or even board up this property, and so that also was left abandoned. Thankfully it never caught the eyes of opportunistic squatters, and after a while even the postman stopped making deliveries there, and so we appreciated the relative peace this lack of neighbours brought us. I wanted for nothing as a child. My mother, Catherine, was doting, and my father, supportive. I can't say if being an only child affected the way they treated me, nor if there would have been more or even less love had there been more children in the family. As I had no way of comparing my situation, I had no point of reference and therefore never missed any alternative life. You can't miss what you don't know. Life passed me by uneventfully. There were no Tom Brown-style stories from my time at school. There were no eccentric aunts constantly visiting us, and there were no local children for me to go off on wild boyhood adventures with, maybe investigating streams or building tree houses. No, I enjoyed playing with my cowboy and Indian toys on my own as I watched the television serials. And every month or so as a treat, my parents would take me to the local Odeon cinema to watch a film, a time I always looked forward to and later treasured. The films were always full of glamour and, when filmed in Technicolor, revealed the world they moved in all the more to me. It was as far from our North London home as you could get, and so my life went on this way. Nothing really happened of any consequence until perhaps my 7th year, when my mother, who'd enjoyed good health until then, became suddenly ill and died, all within a matter of a few weeks. A problem exists when you're young. It seems that there are so many things to learn around and about you of a physical nature that you tend to have the more emotional and intangible parts of life just passed you by. It's possible to arrive at a workplace when in your adult life and notice that a colleague is having what is often described as a bad day, or that your lover or partner is under the weather, but this does not apply to children. They only know that they are being ignored and so are unintentionally selfish. So even though I state that my mother had died within a matter of weeks, what I should say is that within these few weeks I felt my life disrupted and my mother was present in my life a lot less. My father would often be running around with bags packed for overnight hospital stays, and our previously quiet household now became thrown into comparative chaos. I did not know why or how it had happened. There was no time for explanation, and, in the days after her death, very few words came from my father. He quietly dressed me and sent me off to school, or simply disappeared to cry behind closed doors while I tried my best to continue playing in the hallway outside. As time passed by, I spent more and more time alone with the television and all the stars on its warm, glowing screen as my babysitter, while my father made all the necessary arrangements for the funeral. A week went by, and what I can only view as chaos once again entered our home. My mother's family had been Irish Catholic and insisted on all the traditions of a funeral as they saw it. Our sitting room was turned into an exhibition area for my mother and her coffin, the family milling around pretending to pay what they thought were respects as my father rushed from person to person, filling glasses while they commented on our house, even though they had never, as far as I could recall, ever visited before. At one point, my father lifted me up to see my mother lying in the coffin, in state, naturally quite still, and wearing clothes I hadn't seen her wear before. The thought occurred to me that they perhaps switched her with a doppelganger, and that my mother was elsewhere, avoiding the raucous cacophony of this rabble. How I envied her. The coffin itself was just like in the cowboy adventure serials I'd been watching, with half the lid laid closed and the other half open to display her to the room, appearing to me just like the saloon bar doors I'd seen. It all seemed so bizarre. As my father lifted me down to the floor again, an apparently drunk uncle interrupted the moment. We'd never had alcohol in the house as both my parents were teetotal, but our extended family always liked to drink, or so I'd heard, and so my father had felt inclined to make them welcome by obtaining a stock of various liquors, beers and wines for this leering herd, something he now found himself beginning to regret. The uncle, with one hand on the coffin for support, drunkenly slurred a few poorly chosen words of pity and condolences into my father's ear, but as he did so, he lost his balance completely, falling to the floor and dragging the coffin with it. My mother's corpse fell to the ground. Whatever had been blocking up her nose for appearance's sake suddenly popped out like champagne corks, followed by a slow glut of thick, black liquid oozing onto our, until recently, very clean carpet. My mother had been a calm and graceful lady in real life, and as people gathered her corpse back into the coffin, I knew that not only was this not my mother, but also that respect or fear of death existed neither here in the house nor in the minds or eyes of the onlookers to this ghastly affair. As people might find understandable, the death of my mother hit my father quite terribly, and, although he had never been the most energetic of people in my eyes, he never seemed to recapture what little vibrancy his character had previously enjoyed after the events previously described. Life drifted into a monotony of making sure I was ready for school, fed when necessary, and then ready for bed at night. Weekends passed with little excitement, mainly concentrating around household chores or the necessities of everyday existence, such as fetching groceries or cleaning certain stubborn stains out of carpets. The death of his own mother, not more than 2 years later, strangely seemed to return him back to a more alert existence, with him apparently enjoying life that little bit more. Part of this newfound energy was directed towards myself and a few interests that I had. Noting my fascination with the television set, he obtained tickets for us to view a filming of the then well-known BBC children's entertainment show, Crackerjack. The programme, presented at that time by one Eamon Andrews, a friendly-appearing gentleman, well-suited as all television presenters were, and with an endearing Dublin accent, involved pitting a number of school children, fully uniformed, against each other in a series of increasingly inane challenges, mixed alongside what were considered to be questions of general knowledge. At the end of the programme, the lucky contestants had the chance to return back to school with a much-coveted, crackerjack pencil. I heard many years later that there was a minor black market among TV staff in the trade of those pencils, and so, to stifle this market, the pencils were placed under strict lock and key, only to be given to those deemed worthy on the show itself, and to absolutely nobody else, not even the presenter. Yes, the whole show was, with hindsight, lowbrow, patronising, and perhaps pointless. But I never missed an episode, and I really wanted that pencil. Before we left for the broadcast, while busying myself with getting dressed, my father called me downstairs to see something he'd picked up that day. With a smile on his face that I'd not seen for a long time, he handed me a box. On opening it, I found inside a shiny new camera. It had been a good amount of time since I'd received any sort of present, never mind one to this level. Absolutely overjoyed, I pored over it with eager hands as my father explained as best he could how it worked, although I was far too absorbed with the moment to take in his advice. I insisted on taking it to the BBC studios with us in my school satchel, and once inside, we retreated to what I thought was an amazing spectacle of entertainment. Not only could one experience the cheering audience, the cameras at work, the lights, experience the songs, but best of all, I could see the presenter Eamon Andrews himself in the flesh. At last, the line I had previously experienced between myself and the reality of these people had gone. They weren't just flickering images on a muffled television, they were breathing and living, and it was all there for me. I knew it was something I had to somehow be part of and surround myself with, although I couldn't at that time possibly perceive how or under what circumstances that might eventually occur, as later developing years would reveal to me. Once filming had completed and we were politely yet forcefully asked to leave the studio, I overheard a family discussing the whereabouts of the stage exit and their plans to seemingly ambush Mr. Andrews for an autograph on his exiting the studio complex. I tugged at my father's jacket and begged for him to let me wait as well, and, camera in hand, we found our way towards the stage door and waited patiently with one or two other families for it to open. After around an hour had passed, and my father checking his watch with increasing impatience, he finally suggested to me that it was likely that Mr. Andrews had either left via another exit, or we had simply missed him. Whatever had happened, it didn't change the fact that we had to catch our bus home before the services stopped. Downhearted and tired, I took my father's hand and walked with him to the bus stop. Presently the bus arrived and we took our seats for the journey home. After only perhaps a minute or so of travelling, a very large car appeared to be blocking the road ahead. Its bonnet lay open with a chauffeur tinkering around the steaming engine within. As we stopped to let traffic on the other side of the road pass us by, who should jump on board our bus but Mr. Andrews himself, apparently frustrated at his broken down vehicle and, like us, desperate to get home. I was fixated in awe at this now all too real character and begged my father to bother him for a photograph. With hindsight, I suppose he was tired after performing the show, but agreed to my request and even took interest in my camera. He came across as such a pleasant gentleman, I quite forgot and now chose to disregard any negatively cautious warnings about never meeting one's heroes, and now swore to meet as many of my heroes as possible. I was sure that not only would they be as charming and gracious as Mr. Andrews now appeared to me, but also that my hopes had been met and also exceeded. He descended from the bus before us, and I watched as he faded into the distance while the bus sped us home. I spent the rest of that journey gazing at my camera in satisfied bemusement, with my father smiling contentedly at a job well done. Days after that eventful evening, I had been so desperate to see my photograph that I'd busied myself in successfully filling the rest of the camera with random shots of the house, the garden, some children playing outside my house in the street, anything to get it finished. My father had by now framed our tickets for Crackerjack and put them on display in the upstairs hall. Only a week later, I'd received back my new prints, and a picture of Mr. Andrews now took pride of place framed upon my bedroom wall. This was much better than any Crackerjack ticket or even a pencil. I was happy.
13. Mr. Jeremy Cove, actor. 14. Miss Sylvia Moore, actress. 15. Mr. Leonard Rivingly, actor.
A few weeks after the encounter, the novelty of the whole experience had still not faded from my mind, and it bore away at my thoughts as if it would work its way right through to the very bottom of my skull. A symptom of this newfound obsession was to question my father at every turn about the sort of people who made television programs, also films, radio shows, and anything related. I wanted to know what sort of houses they lived in, whether they ate the same food as us, how they were plucked from normal life to be chosen for stardom to start with. Eventually, perhaps out of frustration or boredom of my seemingly never-ending torrent of questions, my father gave me a magazine that had been given away as a supplement in an old newspaper. 30 Famous Faces of Stage and Screen. This supplement featured the 30 most famous performers and people working in the film and drama industries of the day and, most importantly, along with their photographs, not all of them flattering I might add, and basic details such as their favourite food, music, pastimes, and a brief but informative list of their most recent or famous endeavours in the world of show business. Whereas most children of my age, I suppose, whiled away their hours under the sheets reading superhero comics or about the latest football stars and their cars, I was happily studying this glorious new window into the world of the glamorous. I decided that to meet each and every one of these marvellous people and take their photographs just as I had done with Mr. Andrews was to be my new hobby. After only a day or two of reading, I could recite the most trivial of details regarding each person featured in the magazine word for word. I begged my father to question me on each and every element, and, even when he was too tired or distracted to participate in this energetic display of knowledge, I would tell him random details anyway, and be extremely offended if he didn't react to the information with the same interest as I had. The pull-out was eventually put to the side, although not out of view, but I would return to it whenever I had had a bad day at school or had been bullied by the other children, which was often. I found myself marked out as being different because of the death of my mother, and chose to read books and film magazines instead of joining the other boys playing football. This, apparently, meant that I was worth less than them, and they took every possible opportunity to remind me of it. The girls there were not any different. The boys would kick me over in the school corridors, to which the girls would cackle with glee like some group of deranged chickens. I tried on a few occasions to convince my father to go to the school and do something about this treatment, but he never seemed to have the time, something I would grow to resent him for. With the exception of one girl, who I will discuss later, the experience of having to deal with these people taught me to detest the so-called normal members of the public. As life went on, I found comfort with my own company and never missed conversation or interaction with others. On leaving school, I successfully applied for university. My only friend came with me, the supplement, which was the first thing into the bottom of my kit bag along with my camera, now a little worse for wear. My father hadn't the money to help me attend drama school in my earlier years as I had hoped, with a view to joining the world of those I so admired, but he explained, and I too realised and understood, that my studies would help open a door to the world of journalism. This would be a steady and respectable career that also carried the prospect of meeting some well-known faces from time to time. I agreed with his logic and threw myself into my studies at university with gusto. During my time, I worked my way into the university's magazine as entertainment columnist, eventually rising to the heady heights of editor-in-chief. 3,500 students would now hear my view on the world in glorious red and black smudged print. Naturally, as people graduated from their courses, the contributors to the magazine changed on an almost termly basis, meaning that every role had to be refilled, including that of the entertainment editor. Strangely enough, no people ever came forward that were good enough in my eyes for the role. They either didn't have the knowledge or the interest that I personally possessed, and therefore expected of them. And so unfortunately, it always fell to me to carry out the interviews with local actors, which also came with a few opportunities for photographs. After graduation, I was fortunate enough to obtain a position at a small yet reputable newspaper in London as a deputy features editor, and, with my first pay packet, I could finally afford to upgrade to a new semi-professional camera. My daytime position would dictate my schedule, but at night I could use my ever-growing network of contacts in the film and television industries to gain entry to the vibrant party scene, where I would, under the pretense of attending in an official capacity, take photographs of the many attending stars and well-known faces to continue and expand my personal collection, and also add to the 30 famous faces. I understood from the start that all pleasures should have their limits, and this should be no exception. I decided to keep my collection within a boundary that was tangible and completely set. It seemed that this 30 famous faces was the most appropriate line in the sand, and so it became my goal to obtain every picture within it, and then stop. It had started with Mr. Raymond Andrews, but by the early years of my career, my collection of photographs had grown at a satisfying rate. Even though only a small proportion of these pictures were actually part of the 30 elements of my final goal, I found it pleasant enough to add these extra images to the fringe of my collection, as I still appreciated their worth for what they were, even if they didn't contribute to the final tally. One evening, while milling around one of the many celebrity parties I had the good fortune to attend, I caught a glimpse of a tall and robust blonde lady who I recognised immediately. Surrounded by fawning men was none other than Sylvia Moore, star of the silver screen herself and, more importantly, number 14 in my 30 Famous Faces book. A more golden opportunity one couldn't hope to find, and I rushed forwards to introduce myself and request a photograph. Begrudgingly, Miss Moore posed with one hand on her hip and another casually by her side, and awaited the familiar click-flash of the camera. But it did not arrive. Panic flooded over me. Something was dreadfully wrong. Trying again, the camera still would not cooperate, and the realization hit me, with sweat now dripping down my brow, that I had used the last of the film within and needed to change immediately. Making my hurried apologies, I ran to the upstairs of the house in search of a bathroom, but on opening it found not a temporary dark room to change a film, but two lovers apparently sweatily occupied and none too pleased for my intrusion. Running out, I passed door after apparently useless door until my eyes set on a cupboard at the end of the hallway. Dashing into it, and with the light of only the crack in the door to guide my activity, I changed the film, slammed the camera closed, and successfully tripped out of the cupboard and fell knee first to the floor. The pain in my leg was not going to be as much as the pain I'd feel if I failed to get the picture taken. I rested myself up from the floor, scurried down the stairs to the main party room to find Miss Moore, but, on scanning the guests there present, could see her nowhere at all. I tried all other rooms in desperation before heading outside in a panic, just in time to see her stepping into a waiting taxicab and apparently giving her address to the driver. I ran to the car. I banged on the window to let her know that I was ready and that she should return outside of the car if only for a moment, but it was not enough. She assured me there would be another time and apologised as the car sped away into the night, leaving me with nothing but the feeling akin to that of being shot in the stomach. On returning home, I slunk upstairs to my bedroom and sank into my mattress, defeated.
A letter from the desk of J. Montague, Stanwick University.
Dearest Father, I have found life at university to be more than satisfactory. I apologise for not having written to you for these past months since starting, but I hope that you will understand my days have been filled with activities both as part of my studies and extracurricular. I find my studies to be of the utmost importance, which I trust you will additionally wish to hear, as I would also like to thank you for the checks you have continued to provide for my keep while here. You were quite correct stating on my leaving that my studies would go by at a simpler pace if I had less to worry about. The university has a wonderful selection of groups and unions. I have found myself positioned on the team running the university magazine, and already feel as if it could be a real option for a career path to follow once I graduate. But let's see what time brings. I should mention I'll be spending the Christmas holidays here in the halls, as I can't possibly get away from my studies this semester. Perhaps I might be home for Easter. Please keep the checks coming. Best wishes, your son. As my years at the newspaper passed by, I rose to become the main features editor and settled into my role with ease. I should stop here to explain a little. I don't mean to give an impression that I was perhaps complacent or becoming jaded by the experience. On the contrary, it became a pleasant time in which I could create articles on my favourite subjects of glitz and glamour while still getting out and about to photograph the dashing subjects of the pieces themselves. I was offered a number of photographers to work with, and it seemed to be the most fascinating coincidence that they too failed to meet the standards of the job, just like at university, and so it yet again fell upon me to complete all the tasks at hand that were deemed necessary to complete the article submissions. It was such a burden that I feel modest enough to say I carried with humility and maybe even a little pride. These assignments were, for the most part, mediocre, with little in the way of achieving what was slowly becoming my obsession, to have photographs of all 30 faces in the supplement. As the years went by, the news would bring reports of celebrities moving abroad, and therefore out of the reach of someone like myself in such a lowly journalistic position. Also, perhaps representing a higher level of frustration for myself, people would be so inconsiderate as to actually die and move even further out of reach than those who had gone to foreign climes. To reach those in other countries, I needed merely to apply for a passport. To gain entry to the afterlife seemed an altogether more complicated procedure, and so I dismissed these faces as unobtainable and marked their pages with a red circle that represented only disappointment. To die is one thing. To die in situations that are not within your sphere of control is quite another. The people who had become red circles all had one thing in common: they had died prematurely. But it had been by their own hand. Of those 5 people that had so far passed on, 1 had died in a car crash caused by reckless driving, 2 by an overdose of prescribed medication, 1 had choked on his own vomit after winning an Academy Award and then celebrating it perhaps too much, and the last, after complaining that her theatre dressing room was too cold, accidentally set fire to herself when her bathrobe became entangled into the electric fire they gave her. I would usually take great pleasure from reading about people removing themselves from the gene pool so unselfishly, but as this represented a further deprecation of my final goal, I could think of it as them being selfish and extremely inconsiderate. From time to time, however, requests would come through for me to cover for other journalists who were either ill or otherwise engaged to a level that they couldn't take on a story, and so, in the absence of work for myself, I would begrudgingly take on the task. It seemed wise for me to do this, so we didn't have as many celebrity-based stories coming into the paper to satisfactorily fill my column each week, and I feared that it might jeopardise my position if I was seen to be somewhat less than busy. Most of these assignments were of purely local interest, but one day I had the good fortune to cover a particular funeral. At first, I thought the idea, it less than enamoured itself to me, but the family of the deceased felt that the event should have some sort of press coverage. I was not one to argue with this, and I frankly did not care one way or another until I saw the name. Sylvia Moore, actress, model, beloved mother.
The funeral will be held at St. Mary's, Star of the Sea Church, around 11 a.m. Mourners are requested to make a charity donation in place of flowers.
Next week, James Montague begins to shed his morals to complete his collection, but at what cost? The next episode will be released to all streaming services next Wednesday. Subscribe now to get notified on its release. All music is by Shane Ivers of Silverman Sound. The Dead Famous was written and produced by Ronald Moger. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Instagram at This Is Soberville.